Welcome back to Bitcoin Magazine's Weekly Bits podcast, our newsroom recap of the most impactful stories we're publishing. My name is Peter Chawaga. I am a senior editor at Bitcoin Magazine, and today I am joined by my fellow editor and staff writer, Colin Harper. How's it going, Colin?
Hey, Peter. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good. It's good to see you. This is your first day back in the office after an extended trip to Europe, and that brings me to the articles I'm hoping to discuss for this episode, your Living on Bitcoin in Europe series.
Hell yeah, buddy. It was a good trip. I kind of rolled it into vacation at the end of it, kind of killing two birds with one stone, work and vacation. But yeah, I was gone for about 3 weeks, and it's good to be back in the States, good to be back in Nashville, and yeah, looking forward to running through the article series for you because it was a pretty fun time.
Yeah, the articles are great, super well done, super unique to the type of story we do at Bitcoin Magazine. For those who haven't had a chance to see them, there are three articles in this series. They're published a couple of weeks ago, but they can be found on Bitcoin Magazine if you just search Living on Bitcoin in Europe. So for starters, I wanted to ask Colin, what made you want to kind of tackle this article and maybe highlight all the spots you hit on your trip?
You mean like besides getting to go to Europe?
Right, aside from just the company-paid vacation to Europe where you're eating at cafes. And
yeah, honestly, kind of hard to reconcile a little bit with my conscience. Not really, but yeah, so, for context, I did this in San Francisco in January of this year, and it was like, I don't know, it was interesting because I thought it was going to be perhaps more eventful than it actually was. And I took my cue from a former Forbes journalist, now she works for the New York Times, named Kashmir Hill. Yes, like the song, for anyone wondering. And back in 2013 and 2014, she decided to only use Bitcoin for a week to live. And she paid for food this way. She bought a bike in Bitcoin to get around. She even stayed a few days in a hacker hostel, Mission 20. And so she did it for a week, and it was it wasn't the easiest thing in the world, wasn't the most difficult. So I decided to try to do it in San Francisco. It turned out to be really boring. None of the stores accepted Bitcoin anymore. I was just using Bitrefill and Paxful to buy gift cards to eat and to get around with Uber. And so I thought to myself, okay, well, it didn't work so well in San Francisco, but I've heard really good things about a few cities in Europe that are supposed to be Bitcoin hotspots, and I thought maybe it'd work a little bit better there. And lo and behold, it was a hell of a lot more interesting than the first installment. So really the impetus was kind of, I had done it in America in one city. The only other city I could probably get around with it was probably New York, maybe Austin, maybe Chicago. But so I wanted to see if I could do it in Europe and if I could do it a little bit better.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going out of order here, but I know you hit Prague, Berlin, Amsterdam.
Yeah, and then Arnhem was the last one.
Arnhem, right.
Yeah, so the order was I actually landed in Brussels, took a train to Amsterdam. Then I spent a day there, went to Arnhem, spent 2 days there, then went to Berlin for the Lightning Conference, and then ended up in Prague.
So, yeah, my impression from reading this series and your series in San Francisco was that compared to the last time when you did this in America, it was a little bit easier, more interesting, as you said, and just in general, in those cities at least, like straight up more businesses are accepting Bitcoin for their services.
Yeah, that was pretty much nailed it. That's the too long didn't read. And I think that was like that was the important thing for me is I wanted to actually go to places that accepted Bitcoin rather than just going through Bitrefill and then like buying Uber Eats credit or something like that, or Uber credit and doing Uber Eats, or like maybe getting like a gift card for another like McDonald's or some garbage like that. Because when you do that, it's kind of funny. It's like you're paying in Bitcoin, but like you're not really paying in Bitcoin, and it's actually kind of funny because the people don't know you're paying in Bitcoin. It's kind of this weird kind of disconnect, But there's something cool about that, right? Like if you were just banking on Bitcoin, you could use these services to buy pretty much anything you'd need in the developed world, which I thought was pretty cool and eye-opening. But this time around, yeah, like from the moment I landed in Amsterdam, or within 2 hours of being in Amsterdam, I ended up being able to go to a cafe and order a coffee and a sandwich with Bitcoin. And so like right off the bat, within the first 2 hours, it was already panning out to be better than the San Francisco trip, where it took me 4 days before I actually bought something point of sale with Bitcoin. and it ended up being a glass piece, actually.
So I do want to ask kind of a more granular question before asking about some of the more thematic, big picture stuff. What was kind of the general sentiment you're getting from an otherwise standard business that did take BTC? So I'm kind of asking about a cafe that's more used to people coming in and paying in euros or whatever, but they do have, upon special request, sort of like a Bitcoin enabled payment service. Is it frustrating to them to have to whip out the iPad for that? Is it like this is just a way we're going to bring in, more people into the cafe because we're letting them pay this way? Like, what is the benefit to them to, quote unquote, like a normie business? Why are they adopting Bitcoin?
Yeah, so this is actually a question I asked a lot of people, especially when I was in Arnhem and in Amsterdam. So the short answer is it depends on the merchant. It depends on who's working the counter. The longer answer, when I was in Amsterdam and Arnhem, basically all of the businesses there accept Bitcoin because of this one dude named Patrick, who and some of his business partners, including Annette, who run this service called BitCasa, which is basically a point of sale terminal that will accept the Bitcoin payments for the merchants, and then at their request either send it to a wallet that the merchants then control, or liquidate it and then wire them the funds. And so, and in the case of in the Netherlands, for the places where that's accepted, I asked a lot of the merchants, especially in Arnhem, because Arnhem is where Patrick's from, and that's the Bitcoin city. They have a website called Bitcoin Stad. Stad is city in Dutch and German. And basically, I asked all the merchants there, I was like, why do you guys do this? And I kind of joked with them, is it because Patrick's really charming? Is he just really convincing? I didn't really get why they would choose to do it, because it's not very many people paying in Bitcoin, as you could probably guess. And the consensus was kind of that I think some people actually legitimately, like a few answers I got where people were like, this seems to be the future. Digital payments are where we're heading. So this currency, this basically digital bank and digital monetary system seems to be something that they should learn how to use. So I think some of it is legitimate curiosity. I think some of it is also perhaps peer pressure is not the right word, but once a dozen stores take it, then the next dozen are easier to onboard, and so on and so forth. Once they saw more people doing it, it became more acceptable, even if it is still a novelty. I think some do have legitimate interest in the technology, and some actually hold what they get from it. So it's kind of like a nice little savings hedge. When I was in Berlin and Prague, though, I got the idea, because fewer places accept Bitcoin in those cities than in Arnhem and in Amsterdam in total. I kind of got the idea in Berlin and in Prague that the people who were doing it were actually Bitcoiners and were actual, people who were interested in it. Like, for instance, Room 77 is the perfect example. The guy who runs that's a long-time cypherpunk. He's been into Bitcoin since 2011. I mean, he was on the cryptographic mailing list, if I recall correctly. He'd been keeping track of former attempts at digital cash, like back with like eGold and BitGold and following all those things. And then one of the guys in Prague that runs a cafe called Usadu, I think he's just a Bitcoiner. So there's not really much of a benefit for the people, to be honest, unless you're looking at it as a way to save some money. But it's, if I'm being frank, it's technically more laborious because they're going to have to go, they're going through Patrick, who's then going to liquidate it for them into euros and then send it to them. So,
right. So, and that's kind of what I'm getting at, is like the dream of Bitcoin is that it will be really easy, better medium of exchange for merchants, because there will be no transaction fees, or payment will be more seamless. I think maybe the fact that they're like accruing Bitcoin and using that as a savings hedge sort of speaks to that, but there didn't seem to be yet. I mean, maybe adoption's the first step, really, anyway. But there didn't seem to be anything yet that's an actual tangible promise that's realized.
Yeah.
When otherwise normal cafe is like accepting Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, and I kind of got a little bit of a taste of that promise in Arnhem, because one of the things that Patrick said, I was kind of asking him this, is like, why would they do this if this is just another hoop to jump through? And he said, again, part of it is some people believe that they should just try to dabble in it. It's not that much of a headache necessarily, because it's not too difficult to use. Only one or two merchants or like cashiers really were annoyed when I asked to pay for it because it doesn't take that long, especially if you're using Lightning. But one thing he said was there was one instance where a butcher buys, and I actually went to this butcher, he buys bread from a local cafe or from a local bakery that also accepts Bitcoin, and they'll pay for like if he has Bitcoin in his wallet, then he'll pay for the bread in Bitcoin. And so there's a circular economy there, albeit very small. And I think that's going to be the thing that, once the Lightning Network gets to a maturation point where it becomes usable and feasible, or some secondary network, I think that's what it's really going to take to have sufficient merchant adoption, is not just being able to pay for Bitcoin elsewhere, but for the merchants to be able to exchange it for goods with each other. That's going to be crucial, but obviously we're not there yet.
Right. And so in addition to sort of like this is a cool experiment, let's try using Bitcoin in Europe. One other big thing I took away from your article, and this is probably influenced because you were at the Lightning conference, you were kind of among the Bitcoin community in Europe, but that you sort of had this idea that you're a little bit emboldened or saw adoption enough there that you're like interested in sort of taking some of that energy and kind of like continuing to fight the good fight, as it were, like pushing for Bitcoin adoption, and would like to see us, like as you said, compared to San Francisco, there's a lot more adoption in your experiment, most recently in Europe, and that you're kind of like motivated to push for adoption or feel like that good energy could be brought over here to America, and that we might kind of make some strides to be more like that.
Yeah, especially the cypherpunk values that I saw. And I definitely do think there's obviously a selection bias because I did go to the Lightning conference and I was like juiced afterwards because it's just all of these like Bitcoin geeks and all of these cypherpunks, packed into like a single, a single space. But yeah, I mean, that is one thing I did take away, is that the Europeans that I was interacting with in the cities that I was in, at least, seemed to have more of a cypherpunk ethos. I mean, you can see it with like, hacker communities, which they exist in the United States, but like Parallel-Polis is the one that I went to in Prague. I also went to Seabase in Berlin, which is not just Bitcoin specific, but they've got Bitcoiners in there. Obviously, there's some intersection, but it's a very, very prominent hacker space. They say the first in the world, they claim. I would like to see some of that more in the United States, because I think it's kind of ironic that we're the country whose government commits probably the most egregious privacy abuses, and yet people are kind of complacent. We think, well, our government perhaps wouldn't exercise those against its people, or they just don't care as much. I don't know. I kind of had the feeling that the Europeans are more kind of concerned with privacy, and they have more. They technically, I mean, theoretically, whether or not this pans out in practice this way, because European countries are also probably engaging in mass surveillance, but they have the GDPR protection laws in the EU, which are privacy protection laws that we don't have in the United States. Even my one of my friends that I visited in Belgium after the assignment when I went on vacation, even he uses DuckDuckGo, and he's not even a Bitcoiner, and he's a big privacy head. And I kind of talked to him about it too. And I don't really have a conclusion for why that is. I think maybe it's because we're the world's superpower in the United States, so we've kind of gotten complacent with the amount of power our government has, and we kind of just see it as a fact of life, and we think we're the good guys, maybe. But I just, for whatever reason, I saw that people were in Europe. A lot of people were more willing to have open conversations about those kind of privacy things. And this is not to say that we don't have those among us here in America. There are those of us, but like share of population, maybe not so much. Because again, my friend in Belgium, he's not a Bitcoiner, and it was a big topic for him. And the other thing I noticed too is there wasn't as much of a stigma for me spending my Bitcoin. I feel like in America, whenever I tell people I'm going to do something like this, they're like, "You're an idiot. You should just hold on to it."
That's what my next question was. So like, I'm a hodler for sure. And if I was going to go buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin, I would be like, ugh, I wish I didn't just lose that Bitcoin and, kept the fiat in my wallet instead. So am I kind of part of the problem that way and curbing adoption or not encouraging it among merchants?
I don't think you're part of the problem. I mean, I'm the first person to say also it's your Bitcoins to do with it what you want. I guess that's where it is for me. It's like, if you want to hodl, like that's great. If I want to spend, I think that's also good. And I don't think we should be necessarily telling each other how we should spend our Bitcoin. That being said, I do think the hodling use case and the savings use case is a good use case. But we're not developing the Lightning Network so people can hodl, right? We're developing the Lightning Network so that we can have a tool with which to spend Bitcoin and to unlock certain applications, either online or even just as simply being able to spend it in person in a way that will, kind of bootstrap a circular economy. And I do think that eventually, if we really want Bitcoin as a monetary system to be successful, a circular economy is going to have to develop, right? So like the digital gold meme is a good meme because no one's spending gold anymore, right? I mean, you're not going to go to your you might go to your pawnbroker and exchange it for cash, but you're not going to go into a restaurant and try to, or like go to a hotel and, you stay 5 nights in the Ritz-Carlton and try to pay with a 1 ounce gold piece, right? Like no one's doing that. But, gold also arose as a means of exchange and as a store of value, kind of simultaneously, but it was used as a means of exchange at one point. And I think we are going to have Bitcoin being used as a means of exchange if the digital gold meme and its imminence as a decentralized digital monetary system is going to remain intact. Like we're going to need that eventually. Now, do I blame people for not spending their Bitcoin right now? Like, no, absolutely not, because there's not really any way that you can necessarily. But eventually, if we have enough people who believe in this stuff enough to where they keep the majority of their wealth in it, which is another thing I think Europeans might be more comfortable with. I don't know. Some of our American listeners might be like cursing me for saying that, because I don't know, a lot of American Bitcoiners probably
not our listeners. I think you're safe with anyone who's tuning in here.
But I think once more people are comfortable with holding the majority of their wealth in Bitcoin, and they start seeing price rises and they're not willing to cash out into fiat as much, your wealth is growing. And let's say that you have most of your savings in Bitcoin, and you take your weekly or biweekly paycheck in cash. Then you're going to use that cash to get around. But if Bitcoin starts increasing in value year after year, you might be incentivized to spend some of your holdings because it's value that has accrued over the year, and you might be wanting to spend that value, right? Because it's additional money in your savings that you didn't have before. So if number go up, then you might not feel as bad about your local, Levi merchant accepts Bitcoin now for whatever reason. I'm going to go get a new pair of jeans or something like that.
Yeah, just that last point, maybe it's a double-edged sword. The more a number go up, the more I'm like, ooh, wait, I got to hold on to this Bitcoin. But, right, once the monetary system throughout the world collapses, then I'll be spending my sats for sure.
Yeah, and that's the thing, too. I think once if we really do get to a point where, if the dollar becomes worthless, and most currencies end up becoming worthless, places in high stress areas right now, places like Venezuela and Argentina, they're not spending their Bitcoin, they're using it to exchange value between other currencies. And that's great, but if Bitcoin becomes the most stable currency, then people are going to be naturally incentivized to spend that Bitcoin. And then once we get there, that's just an entirely different ballgame. I mean, I don't know if we'll ever get to that point where it does become the world reserve currency, but if it does, man, that's going to be something to see.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming in, Colin. Thank you for going to Europe and coming back to report on, Bitcoin adoption there. Is there anything else about that series you'd want listeners to know?
Definitely, if you're in Europe, I would highly recommend. If you're in Europe, if you're in Europe or you're a European Bitcoiner or you're an American, you're traveling in Europe, I highly recommend giving Arnhem a visit. That was probably my favorite place I visited during the entire trip. Just because as a city, there are just so many ways you can spend your Bitcoin if you're willing to do that. I bought vinyl records. I could have done an escape game. It was really cool. And the dude, Patrick and BitCasa, they're doing fabulous work over there. Really just honest, hard work by the sweat of their brow. They don't take any fees for their service. But highly recommend going to Arnhem. Really can't sing its praises enough. Also, if you're a Dutch listener, give the Bitcoin Show by our own Aaron Van Weerdem a listen. I went to a meetup my first day there, got to meet Boris, one of his co-hosts, and that was really cool. But yeah, I guess I'd give those two people a shout out.
Awesome, man. And where can everyone find you on the internets?
I am. You can find me on Twitter at As I Lay Hodling. You can also just look up my name, Colin Harper. That's 1 L. On Twitter, you'll see me. I've got a goofy little profile picture. And obviously, you can also find me on bitcoinmagazine.com.
Awesome. The Bitcoin Magazine Weekly Bits podcast is a BTC Media produced podcast on the Let's Talk Bitcoin network. It was produced and edited by Graham Peterson and David Hollerith. If you're interested in reading the story we discussed or others like it, check out our homepage at bitcoinmagazine.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter at Bitcoin Magazine to keep up with all the latest. You can find more engaging podcasts over at letstalkbitcoin.com, and you can follow them on Twitter at the LTB Network for all the latest episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the show on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you enjoy the show, please take a few seconds to give us a rating and review. It really helps us improve and reach new listeners. Finally, I want to remind listeners about the upcoming Bitcoin 2020 conference being held in San Francisco from March 27 to 28 next year. It's already shaping up to be the biggest Bitcoin conference ever, and I know there's a ton more to announce. You can learn more at bitcoin2020conference.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week.